Thank you so much, Corey. And really wonderful to see so many people here from all over. And I would like to introduce our panelists for our first plenary session, Kamilah Dummond-Forrester and Catherine Wong. That both Camila and Catherine are experts around SEL and the intersections of SEL with social justice, equity, and culturally responsive teaching, among many other areas of expertise and long histories in education, in school settings, out of school settings, in higher ed, and beyond. So welcome, Camila.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be here.
And welcome, Catherine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jim.
So, back in February, we had a conversation kicking off the showcase that we had then about how the country was responding to the protests of racial brutality and how that was impacting schools. And here we are. It was November, and if you look in the news here in Massachusetts, the national news, and if you just talk to people about what's happening in our communities, issues of racial justice and equity are front and center in people's lives. And I'm wondering, how do you see that impacting students and educators at this point?
Catherine, do you want to start? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's impacting our children in the ways that it's impacting us as adults, right? Kids are walking into school buildings, classrooms, overhearing conversations that are happening at home in their community, watching news clips, reading newspapers, and trying to make meaning out of what's going on. There's a level of stress, anxiety, and confusion that I have noticed among our children right now in terms of all of the different emotions that these recent events are eliciting. The confusion is also around watching how adults are navigating their emotions. And I think something that's important for us to always remember in these conversations is that our children are always watching us. And so our children are watching adults navigate how to be in conversation with other adults who don't have the same values, don't have the same experiences as they do. They are watching adults navigate strong emotions, and they're taking note. And we're seeing that mimicked, the things we're seeing in the broader news, we're seeing that mimicked in school classrooms in terms of fights, arguments, saying things that kids don't even really fully understand what it means, but it's still causing harm. And so I think what we're noticing in the national news, what we're seeing happening nationally across our country is exactly what's being mimicked in the classrooms and in school districts across our country. And this is a time that is not new to us as a country, right? We've been here before, multiple times before. There are many points in history where we can point to similar events happening. And the thing that this makes me think about most is the fight, flight, freeze response. And I feel like as a country, we are in fight mode. We are in this hyper vigilant, hyper triggered mode that prevents us from being able to sit down and have meaningful conversations that can bridge, build, and really help us to move forward collectively.
I want to piggyback on what Camila started to say and add to it that in terms of the way that I see it affecting not just students, as Camila said, right? It's affecting all of us. And I think it's affecting us in three ways. One, I see it affecting it through a lens of contradiction. And as I think about my own life and think about the trauma that I've had to sort of endure as an Asian Pacific Islander, I identify as both Chinese and Hawaiian. And that's very, very important to me because your race becomes your face, and that's not accurate. So I think that in terms of the contradiction is that young people are having to come to school identifying one way, but really thinking about themselves in another. So how often, as those of us that have had to check ourselves at the door, what are we asking? What masks are we asking our young people to wear beyond that physical material over our face? That so often students of color and first gen are being told they don't have a map in front of them. Mask yourself, act a certain way. And so as I think about the ways that I've been raised, that yes, right, as an AAPI, I'm in the spotlight, but I'm also invisibilized. And I hear that from our young people, not just because I'm an AAPI woman, right? I think in one sense that I can say I can claim education privilege. I've been fortunate to be able to have a graduate degree, but at the same time, I'm still vulnerable. I still experience ageism. I'm not old enough or I'm too young to have the experiences I have, and yet I'm coming to you with over 3 decades. The issue of, there are times that our young people are comfortable, but there are times that they are made to be uncomfortable. And so how do we sort of look at those contradictions, knowing that they're very real in real time? And I think for me, it's about how to negotiate that intersection as opposed to saying they don't exist. Because the last thing to say to a young person is it doesn't exist because you rip away their voice. I think the other is courage, right? How do we not cower from all the attacks that are happening against teaching, against SEL, because that's what the dominant culture wants us to do. They want us to cower. They want us to go away. But you know what? We're still here. And as Camila said, there is a long history of denying culture, of basically saying that the status quo is more important than actually raising the voice of those who are the most minoritized. And I'm very clear that I don't use the word diversity. I use the word minoritized. We need to look at our actions, not just our descriptors. And then third, I think we have to come out of chaos and we need to look at coalition building. And I think that's what's so important about being able to be here with all of you today. I'm very grateful that Camila and I have come into partnership actually through Jim and through SEL4MA. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today to engage in this conversation. I wish we were in person. I could see all your faces. I don't know if you're nodding. I don't know if you're agreeing, but I also know that, in our conversations that Camila and I have said that we cannot shy away, that yes, these are hard conversations. This is difficult, but that's what this work always has been. And we really want to invite you to engage with us, to be with us, and to be in coalition.
Well, that's a wonderful invitation to folks. And let's offer to folks too. Tell us, type in the chat right now. You can tell us in the stage chat that how are you seeing the impacts of issues around social justice, around equity? How are they impacting whether you're in a school time program or a school, if you're here in Massachusetts, or if you may be any place around the country, or we've got someone here from Dubai who's with us as well. So I'm curious as to what you're seeing about what do you see educators needing at this point. That there's a lot going on. There's a lot that people are navigating right now. So anybody who cares about young people, who's working with young people, what have you seen of the kind of the needs that folks have in being able to navigate all this?
Catherine, you can start.
I think that in terms of what's needed is what I left off saying, right? Is that, and what Camila was saying is one, is I think we need to really acknowledge that history is very much a part of this work. And so if you don't know about your history and where you've come from, then how do we actually navigate it with the very families and children that we're teaching? And to excavate that for some of us is hard because sometimes families have chosen not to tell their stories, and we need to unpack why that's happened. I think that when we think about tending to our own wellness, that Camila and I've had conversations about during this time, when we think about SEL, it's not about other, it's also about us. And I think that this past year and a half, just to be really vulnerable with all of you, I think as I teach my students that there's a difference between being vulnerable and giving up your authority. You can actually do both. I can still be your professor and I can actually still be vulnerable. And I think in sharing my vulnerability that I can say that there's been that I saw a stark imbalance between my wellness and feeling like I had to check that at the door versus encouraging the wellness in others. And I think what was so powerful, and I dedicate actually this session to my students, is actually it was my students that pointed it out to me. They said, "You're always telling us what we need. Why don't we ask you what you need, Catherine?" And that sort of, again, this idea of what masks am I wearing? Why do I feel I need to wear these particular masks? I also think in terms of what's needed is the increase of the importance of youth not just having a seat at the table. Like, how do we go beyond representation to truly affirm and value, and basically, again, using the word matter, not as a descriptors, but how do young people really feel mattered? And what is it that we need to do as educators to step up, and doing it as early as elementary school, being able to just greet a young person and ask them, how are you today? No, really, how are you really today? Asking a family, talking, again, when you're doing a parent family conference, again, do you call it a parent conference knowing that every young person has a parent, or do you call it family conferences and you actually invite the most intentional people that are helping to raise a child? So how do we get out of our hierarchical status quo mindset and think innovatively?
Yeah. Ditto, and I say to everything you just said, Catherine. And the only thing that I would add to that is educators need administrators and leaders within their school buildings and districts who have courage. They need leaders and administrators who are willing to stand up for them and with them when they teach certain lessons in the classroom, when they set certain boundaries in the classroom that are about ensuring that all children can feel seen and heard. And they too need rest. They too need balance. And so that's the only other pieces that I would add to, what you shared, Catherine, is that many times I have had conversations with educators who feel like they're in this by themselves in their classroom. It feels siloed. They need leaders and administrators who have the courage of their conviction to stand up with them and for them when they are supporting what the mission and vision of different school districts may be, particularly when those visions and missions are aligned with making sure that all children and all families feel seen, heard, and cared for.
Can you say a little bit more about, we've got folks on here today who are teachers, we've also got folks who are school and out of school time administrators. Camila, you were starting to talk about sort of what that role might be of administrators in creating this environment. Appreciate if you both could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, so one of the things that has been, and I think the pandemic maybe has really elevated this more. I think sometimes we have expectations for our children's wellness and our children's behavior that we don't have for ourselves. And I think it comes down, pieces, right, of this is simply that leaders take the time to invest in their social and emotional wellness as a leader, to take the time to excavate and think about the multiple identities that they carry and how that informs their lens and their leadership decisions. So sometimes the work that leaders are putting money towards or booking PDs for, they're often not in those sessions. And so that in of itself also is a communication to the educators or the youth service workers in that building or in that program. The leaders need to make that same amount of time for their own learning, reflection, and courage building. It also looks like very tangibly if a teacher is feeling attacked by a number of different entities that they know for certain that the leaders of their school buildings and their districts will have their back. They will come out, they will make statements, they will stand with them, they will stay with them after school. If they know people are coming to see that teacher, like this is what that looks like. That we look at our, that we treat the educators and the adults who are in the buildings caring for our kids in the same way that we would expect our kids to have other children's back. And so many times we'll tell our kids, make sure you let an adult know, or make sure you try to find a way to intervene if you get wind that somebody is going to hurt themselves or others in our community. And the attacks on education, the attacks on teachers, this is what's happening. We're getting wind that people are out to hurt educators or themselves. And so where are the leaders, the administrators, school buildings and district-wide who can make sure to say, you know what, I'm leaving the district headquarters and I'm coming to this school today because I heard this is happening. That's what it looks like. It's not, we don't have to overcomplicate these things. It looks like being there. It looks like standing there in arms and having the courage of your convictions.
And Camila, I noticed that Anna made a comment that aligns with what you're saying right now, that teachers need support in how to navigate SEL and equity, and this is without parental pushback, claiming CRT, that which is being called, this is the critical race theory being raised as a kind of specter, without parental pushback, claiming CRT as indoctrination. And this is just like some articles that Catherine, you were sending an article just this morning.
Yeah.
So in agreeing with Camila is this idea of, what role do leaders play in supporting teachers, but also what role do teachers and leaders have together? And I think when I saw Anna's question, I'm actually going to post a reference to an article, to a brief that was written by a number of educators and endorsed by a number of educators that actually will give you all some tools, because I think part of it is not just the how to, but how do we sort of, again, how do we excavate what is actually happening, right? And so I'm going to post it now and just talk about it briefly. And so basically, it's a link to a PDF that is talking about why this is happening and why this is happening now, but also gives you resources. So when you're engaging with, because part of it is how do we call in parents, because we're not going to be able to ask them to check themselves at the door. So when they come at us around CRT, which can mean both critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching. And so part of it is being able to create a line of inquiry questioning about what is it that they think that this is, and what is it that they want for their child. And at the end of the day, when I'm engaging with families, when I'm engaging with students, that what I say is that what I want is I want to prepare a global workforce, that I want a young person to feel that they can enter careers that they might not even know about right now. But in order to do that, what does it mean to actually value a whole person, regardless of what their ethnicity, race is? It's about raising our young people to be truly global citizens. Mm-hmm. And so another resource that I tend to use is Tara Yosa's work on community cultural wealth. And the idea being that we all bring a level of wealth in terms of our identity to our jobs, to our schools, and how do we create a network, connect those dots, as opposed to, again, this level of push. My idea is how do we call in? Because the more that we push out, the more power we give the resistors. And so that's our task, is how do we call in? How do we ask parents, what is it that you really want for your child? How do we have leaders say, this is the mission of our school, and this is how we operationalize it every single day? that we place value on every young person's life, on every teacher. And we do it through a network of community cultural wealth. We do cultural humility where we step back and we give grace, because you know what? I say to my students all the time, right? I'm going to step in it. I'm not perfect. And after all of these years of work, that I will remain a work in progress. And the day I stop saying that to you needs to be the day I retire, which means probably I'm never going to retire. But anyway, I'm not a good example for Camila around retirement. So the idea being that this work is never over, but how do we, I know we're going to move into that question. The question becomes is, how do we support each other when the times get tough? Because certainly I don't diminish that they are. And I hurt for all of us in this moment.
And just to underscore something that you said, Catherine, and something I've been thinking about, it's important for us to understand that all families want the best for their children.
Yes.
Even when they are saying some things that are completely opposite to what you may believe or what your family values may be. At the core of the fight is that families want what's best for their kids. And so if we can all agree to that and then sit down with that understanding and have a conversation, provide resources and information so that what I think is best for my child doesn't now impinge on what Catherine may think is best for her child. And that our children can be in the same space, feeling nurtured, feeling cared for, without either one of our ideals or values impinging on the care and concern of each other's children.
The other thing that I want to sort of add to that is, how do we involve our young people in their school life, right? And so there's a school in Boston actually that has their middle school students sitting on teacher interview committees, right? That they ask questions, they give feedback, and no, they don't have the power to say yay or nay only whether that teacher gets hired, but the principal actually set it up so that there is a student leadership team that is part of the interview process and gives her feedback as to, and again, right, who best knows what's needed in the classroom sometimes is actually our young people. And what I'm so proud to see is our young people are really stepping up, and it's not just marching in the streets. They're asking to be on these types of committees. They're asking critical questions about, why is something not being read or said with regard to their identities. And so part of it is, how do we support them when they're stepping up?
But Catherine, can you say a little bit more about that? That how can we, as educators, as youth development professionals, support youth who are stepping up, youth who are leading in many areas?
I think being able to create space. And so I know the school day is incredibly full. So part of it is whether it's, at lunch, whether it's, after school, but giving young people a space to be showing their leadership, being able to even read, read some of these documents and ask them what they think, asking them to create a group brief around what they feel their school needs and the ways that, I was sometimes, when I was teaching at the university, that I would bring my high school students to be professors for the night. And so what I would say to them is, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom and I'm going to ask you to sit in the front as a panel and tell these aspiring teachers how you learn best. And I also want you to tell them why you disengage and what causes you to disengage. And I would say those tend to be my most powerful courses or classes, is because it switches that hierarchy of that, okay, I'm the authority, I have all this experience, so I'm going to teach top down to the students who are going to be teachers. One, I've never done that. I've always done circle learning. I would say in the smallest rooms that are a square box, figure out a way to get yourselves in a circle. Looking at the back of someone's head doesn't ever create learning. But to really create that circle where, I had freshmen or seventh, actually through 12th graders that were engaging these aspiring teachers. And the idea that, how do we shift our thinking beyond what we know? And that's really hard, because all of us have been institutionalized to feel like this is the way that we learn. we're in a new day, folks, and that the pandemic, I often say, the pandemic is not just COVID. Racism is the pandemic. And how do we unwind ourselves from it and work with it? Because it's not about that it's going to be over soon. It's really about this journey, this process, and exuding that level of cultural humility.
To add to what you said, Catherine, I would also say asking students to give their opinions about the curriculum itself, right? These are the topics that we need to cover this year in this particular class. Here's where I'm thinking about going with it. What piques your interest? What are you wondering about around these topics? You know, do you know of any books or any activities or any places that are in the area that may contribute to the learning of this particular topic? And really engaging students in being a part of contributing to the curriculum that they're learning. Another piece to that is opening up opportunities in conversations in classrooms for students to share their ways of knowing and being as it relates to different topics as well, right? And so one of the things I remember from our work at Open Circle was we would talk about listening skills. And there may be a set of kind of behaviors that's expected in the classroom or in the school building as it relates to listening. But listening, and good listening in quotes, is very different depending on the community you come from, your cultural background, and your family. And we would often encourage educators as a part of that lesson to ask students to go back home and ask their family, what does it mean to be a good listener in our family? What does it mean to be a good listener in our community? And that may look very different than what we're saying good listening looks like in a school building, and that's okay. We have to get into this space where we help students understand the both and. It doesn't always have to be either or. Context matters. And so in this context, maybe this is what that looks like. But in other contexts, it looks different, and they're both okay. They're both right. And so I think those would be the only two pieces that I would add to what you shared, Catherine.
So Jim actually dropped off, so he told us to keep going.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to thank Karen for her input around the needing to upend those power over structures, because I think that's what we're talking about. But part of it is we have to look at the history of how, again, right, how did we get to be the educators that we are? What trained us in a way that we feel we need to either unlearn? Because part of it too is I often really am focused on the language. And so I was actually saying to Camila the other day that, you know, the words reimagine versus rebuild, because I don't want to rebuild back to normal. That's not necessarily working for our young people. And so how do we reimagine a world that we want? How do we reimagine all the things that we just said and all that you are all posting in the chat, right? Yeah. That the idea is the energy is there, but how do we not do it in silos? I think that has been sort of the question, because part of it is we know that training is needed. We know that we can't just walk in and say these descriptors and then it's going to happen. And so part of it is, as many of you have just mentioned through the chat, is what is the intention that we need to bring? And then what is the training that's needed? And so I'm going to lean on Camila a bit to sort of start talking a little bit about sort of the training that's needed.
Right. So I think the training that's needed is representative of the shift that we're seeing needs to happen within teaching and learning spaces, a more integrative and collaborative approach in general. So we have to get out of this siloed mentality where we can only have a conversation about SEL, or we can only have a conversation about history, or we can only have a conversation about social justice. The fact of the matter is that the world that we're living is integrative. There are many things that are connected to one another and inform each of those topics. And so in terms of the training, we really need to be creating training opportunities, professional development opportunities that allow us to make these connections. And so we can't, for instance, we can no longer have a conversation about what effective social and emotional learning looks like and not also simultaneously have a conversation about social justice and equity. Because to do so is to ignore the fact that everything that we do is informed by a cultural lens. And sometimes that cultural lens is harmful. And so we need to begin to have conversations and training for educators that puts it all together, that has a both and feel to it, where we can talk about self-awareness and deepen self-awareness for our children, talk about a reflective practice and engage in reflective practices that is in service of creating an equitable space for all of our learners. That is inclusive of, the wellness, the mental health and wellness of our children in our community. And so PD has to be an integrative approach.
Exactly. And so, in terms of, for Camila and I, that training is sort of, if we think about it in threes, right? That it's interactive, that you can't sort of do training where it's just you're being talked at and then given a cookbook. That this work is not sort of done that way, as you all know, that it's really about how do we interact with each other in a way that allows us to be vulnerable, to be honest, and to know that no question is a bad question, that your experience, that would invalidate your experiences. And so training really needs to be about how do you bring your full self to the work? How do you be able to say that, you can't separate the personal from the professional. And sure, there's certain boundaries that, there's parts of my life I'm not going to tell y'all. But at the same time, I'm also going to still talk about the experiences that, when I was asked last spring several times to do an AAPI talk around all of the anti-Asian violence and racism that was happening, that I was really clear at the onset that doing so was going to elevate a level of trauma for me. But at the same time, I also felt a need to and a desire to give back to my community. And so what I would say to those who invited me is that you would need to have your leaders at this talk or workshop. You would need to have those who could implement change with the Asian Pacific American students, teachers that you were asking me to speak with and about. And that you needed to make a commitment to me around a level of change before I accepted. And the idea was that I didn't want to become a checkbox. Think about all the boxes that we're asked to check every single day. And part of it is, how do we step away from the fact that we've been socialized that we have to check this box?
Yes.
And so for me, it was being able to say, no, I'm not going to allow you to check that box. What I really want us to do is think about a change agency. Think about your theory of change. Why are you asking me? Why is it important to you? And what are you going to do to change it? So part of it is really engaging, because I simply could have just said yes, that I'm a consultant. This is part of my work. But part of it is, how do we not sell our soul in our work and really do what we say we want to do, right? Because that, and it's not that I don't need to make a living, but part of it is, it's really about the intention. How do I have greater social impact in the work that I do right now? And so for me, and when Camila and I are thinking about our trainings together, as we've been asked to put together, we're actually going to do a little commercial. Jim asked us, so I'll blame it on Jim.
In fact, Linda is asked. Can you
Oh, I know. Thank you, Linda. So for us, it has three components before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty details. It's interactive, it's inclusive, and it also believes that you have insights to offer. So it's my 3 I's that I came up with yesterday when I was preparing for this talk. It's interactive, inclusive, and insightful. And on that, I'm going to throw it back to Camila to talk a little about this we're going to do a 5 contact hour training starting in January.
Love the 3 I's, Catherine. So the training will be exactly what we just kind of talked about. We think is needed right now, right? So we'll have a conversation about what does it look like to implement and support movement building around effective social and emotional learning implementation within a school or a district. And a part of that effective implementation includes considering and thinking about, in deep ways, social justice and equity. So we will be in conversation around that. We will ask you to use your personal data to inform and support the conversation that we're having. I think that's another piece of training that's a critical component of it. You know, we can give you stats, but the reality is that you believe your own data. Tap into your own experience. How does your experience inform what you know to be true, and things, you know, what you know to be true and specifically connected to the topic area. So this 5-hour contact PD that we're going to be doing will provide you with some templates, some structures, and some formats to think about the intersection of SEL, social justice and equity, and how to really identify allies, how to build coalition and movement building towards a social and emotional learning agenda within your school or district that is inclusive, and that really is in service of social justice and equitable educational outcomes.
Well, thank you, Camila. Thank you, Catherine. It is fantastic to have this conversation with you to kick off the showcase, and wonderful to have the opportunity to be working with you ongoing around this program and many other parts of SEL4MA and the work that we do to support social justice, equity, anti-racism as really a core of what it means to be doing effective social emotional learning. So thank you very much to you both.
Thank you so much for
welcome.